The morning of April 16th, 1945. Radar Picket Station Number 1, 30 miles northwest of Okinawa. Commander Frederick Julian Beckton stood on the bridge of the USS Laffey, watching the eastern horizon turn from black to grey. His crew had been at battle stations for 18 hours. Every man knew what dawn would bring. For 6 weeks, Japanese kamikaze pilots had been hurling themselves at American ships with a ferocity that made conventional warfare seem almost civilized. But something had changed in the arithmetic of survival. Shells were detonating in mid-air without hitting anything, creating deadly clouds of shrapnel that tore apart aircraft before they could complete their dives. Pilots who should have reached their targets were exploding hundreds of feet away from American ships, their burning wreckage spiraling into the sea. The Japanese High Command had no explanation for this phenomenon. Their intelligence reports spoke of impossibly accurate American anti-aircraft fire, of shells that seemed to know exactly when to detonate. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that American gunners were firing projectiles containing a technology so revolutionary that it had been guarded with the same secrecy as the atomic bomb itself. Each 5-inch shell carried a miniature radar station in its nose, a device so sophisticated that even America's own scientists had initially declared it impossible to build. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This is the story of how a handful of physicists working in a converted garage in Silver Spring, Maryland, created a weapon that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Pacific War. It's the story of the proximity fuse, and of how the Japanese admirals planning the Kamikaze offensive never anticipated that American shells would begin thinking for themselves. August 1940, Washington, District of Columbia. The war in Europe was entering its second year, and France had just fallen to Nazi Germany. In a modest office at the Carnegie Institution's Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, physicist Merle Anthony Tuve received a telephone call that would consume the next 5 years of his life. The National Defense Research Committee wanted to know if he could do the impossible. The problem was brutally simple. American anti-aircraft guns couldn't hit enemy planes. A Navy gunner firing a 5-inch shell equipped with a timed fuse needed to accurately predict where a maneuvering aircraft would be several seconds in the future, manually set the fuse to detonate at that precise moment, and fire before the target changed course. The mathematics were unforgiving. In 1941, the average Navy anti-aircraft battery expended roughly 2,500 rounds to destroy a single enemy aircraft. That wasn't a defense system. It was barely controlled desperation. The British had shared preliminary research during the Tizard mission, that extraordinary exchange of technological secrets that had brought radar and cavity magnetrons to American shores. Among the blueprints and prototype designs was a concept that seemed to belong more to science fiction than to practical engineering. What if an artillery shell could carry its own radar transmitter and receiver? What if it could sense the presence of an enemy aircraft and detonate automatically at the optimal distance? Tuve understood immediately that the theoretical physics were straightforward. The engineering challenges were astronomical. A radar system small enough to fit inside a 5-inch projectile would need to survive forces that destroyed nearly everything subjected to them. When a Navy 5-inch gun fired, the shell accelerated from 0 to 2,800 feet per second in the length of the barrel. That created a setback force of 20,000 times Earth's gravity, 20,000 Gs, applied instantaneously to every component inside the shell. The rifling grooves in the barrel simultaneously set the projectile spinning at 25,000 revolutions per minute. No radio vacuum tube in existence could withstand such punishment. The glass envelopes shattered. The delicate filaments snapped. Even if the components somehow survived being fired, they had to function flawlessly during the brief seconds of flight, transmitting radio waves, receiving the reflected signal, calculating the distance to the target through Doppler frequency shifts, and triggering the detonation circuit at exactly the right moment. And all of this had to happen inside a device small enough to fit in the nose of a standard artillery shell, robust enough that it could be handled by crews in combat conditions, and cheap enough to be manufactured by the hundreds of thousands. Tuve assembled a team at Carnegie that included physicist Richard Roberts, who had worked with him in nuclear physics research, and brought in specialists from across American academia and industry. The project was designated Section T, named for Tuve himself, following the bureaucratic convention of the National Defense Research Committee. By December 1940, Lloyd Berkner, one of Tuve's researchers, had devised a critical improvement using separate circuits for transmission and reception, dramatically simplifying the design. Tuve invited Harry Diamond and Wilbur Hinman from the National Bureau of Standards to examine Berkner's work. Within 2 days, Diamond had produced a working prototype design. By May 6, 1941, 7 months before Pearl Harbor, the team had built 6 functioning fuses, installed them in air-dropped bombs, and successfully tested them over water at the Naval Proving Ground in Dahlgren, Virginia. The bombs had detonated at precisely the right altitude, without any human input beyond aiming and release. But bombs fell under relatively gentle acceleration. Artillery shells did not. The vacuum tube problem remained unsolved. Tuve's team needed tubes that could function as transmitters, receivers, and amplifiers, while being small enough to fit multiple units inside a shell casing barely 20 inches long. They needed batteries that wouldn't explode under acceleration but would activate reliably after firing. They needed safety circuits to prevent premature detonation that could kill American gun crews. The battery problem yielded to ingenious simplicity. Engineers designed a small glass ampule filled with electrolyte solution. When the shell fired, centrifugal force pushed the liquid outward against carbon and zinc plates, creating an electrical charge through simple chemical reaction. The glass would break from the shock of firing, releasing the electrolyte, but only after the shell had cleared the gun barrel. This meant the fuse remained inert during storage and handling, arming itself automatically only after being shot. The vacuum tube challenge required a different approach entirely. Standard radio tubes were far too fragile. Miniature tubes used in hearing aids were smaller but still couldn't survive gunfire. What Tuve's team needed didn't exist, so they would have to invent it. Working with Western Electric Company and Raytheon, engineers began modifying hearing aid tubes, redesigning the filament structure, strengthening the glass envelopes, and developing mounting techniques that would distribute stress more evenly. By September 1941, after months of iterative failure, a complete prototype fuse functioned properly at the end of its trajectory, in a test firing at Dahlgren. The shell had survived being shot from a 5-inch gun, armed itself in flight, transmitted radio signals, detected the reflected waves from a target, calculated the proper detonation point, and exploded. It had worked exactly once, but that single success proved the concept was achievable. January 18, 1942, 6 weeks after Pearl Harbor, the Navy awarded the first production contract for proximity fuses. The device was designated the Mark 32 and given the deliberately misleading designation VT for variable time fuse. The name was chosen by Captain S.R. Shoemaker, director of the Bureau of Ordnance's Research and Development Division, to be descriptive enough for military paperwork without revealing anything about the actual technology. If a fuse fell into enemy hands, the designation would suggest nothing more interesting than an improved timer mechanism. Secrecy became paramount. The fuse represented such a dramatic leap in capability that its existence could not be revealed to the enemy under any circumstances. Each fuse contained approximately 130 separate electronic components, miniaturized to an extraordinary degree. If German or Japanese engineers recovered an intact example and reverse-engineered the design, they could potentially develop countermeasures or copy the technology for their own use. The Manhattan Project received more publicity, but the VT fuse program was guarded almost as carefully. By this time, Section T had outgrown its space at the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism. The team moved into a large building on Georgia Avenue in Silver Spring, Maryland, a 3-story structure that had previously housed a garage on the ground floor and Social Security Administration offices above. The administration was transferred from Carnegie to Johns Hopkins University, and the facility was renamed the Applied Physics Laboratory, with Tuve as its founding director. The walls displayed a series of dictates that Tuve had posted to drive his team's work. "I don't want any damn fool in this laboratory to save money. I only want him to save time. Shoot at an 80% job. We can't afford perfection. In a war, D is necessary and enough, but an F is fatal. Best job in the world is a total failure if it is too late." Those principles shaped every decision. Mass production began before all the engineering problems had been solved. The Crosley Corporation, known for manufacturing radios and refrigerators, received a letter of intent from the Navy in late November 1941 and a contract for 500 fuses in December. The company had been selected because they possessed the required background in electrical and mechanical engineering combined with experience in mass production. By September 1942, the first accepted fuses came off Crosley's production line. But producing the fuses in quantity required mobilizing American industry on a scale that rivaled aircraft or ship construction. Each fuse needed specialized vacuum tubes that didn't exist in commercial production. Sylvania Electric Products, the only company capable of the required quality and quantity, retooled entire factories to manufacture miniature tubes. At their plant in Ipswich, Massachusetts, hundreds of women assembled the delicate components by hand, tedious work that strained the eyes and demanded absolute precision. The women weren't told what they were building. They were searched when entering and leaving the plant. They couldn't bring purses inside. Even the Ipswich police and fire departments were prohibited from entering the building. General Electric plants in Cleveland, Ohio, previously used for manufacturing Christmas tree lamps, began producing tubes for proximity fuses. Assembly facilities opened in Schenectady, New York, and Bridgeport, Connecticut. RCA, Eastman Kodak, and McQuay Norris joined the production effort. By the end of the war, 87 different firms using 110 factories would be engaged in some phase of production work. The coordination required was extraordinary. Tubes, manufactured in Cleveland, had to meet exact specifications so they would fit properly with circuits being assembled in Cincinnati and battery components built in New York. Quality control became its own challenge. Every fuse that left the production line was tested, but tests couldn't perfectly replicate combat conditions. After each production lot was completed, sample fuses were shipped to the National Bureau of Standards, where they underwent rigorous verification. Failure rates had to be tracked, analyzed, and used to refine manufacturing processes. The Navy's minimum acceptable standard was a 50% success rate. That meant one fuse in every two could fail to function, and the weapon would still be considered operationally viable. This seems shockingly low until you understand the baseline. Conventional timed fuses worked approximately 90 to 95% of the time, but they only destroyed an aircraft if the gunner's prediction and timing were perfect. A VT fuse that worked only half the time, but detonated automatically at the optimal distance, was still dramatically more effective than a perfect timed fuse set to detonate at the wrong moment. By the summer of 1942, the first production fuses were ready for combat testing. On August 12th, the newly commissioned light cruiser USS Cleveland conducted live fire evaluation in the Chesapeake Bay. The targets were 3 radio-controlled drone aircraft. The test was scheduled for 2 days. Cleveland's gunners brought down all 3 drones on the first day using just 4 bursts of VT-fused ammunition. Despite evasive maneuvering by the drone controllers, the shells detonated at precisely the right distance, creating lethal clouds of shrapnel that tore through aluminum airframes. The results astonished the Navy observers present. This was more than an incremental improvement. This was a weapon that fundamentally altered the equation of aerial combat. A shell didn't need to score a direct hit. It didn't need to be timed perfectly. It simply needed to pass near enough to an aircraft, and the fuse would handle the rest. The effective lethal radius of a 5-inch shell increased from essentially 0, without a direct hit, to approximately 70 yards in any direction from the point of detonation. December 1942, Pearl Harbor. Admiral William Halsey received orders to send 3 ships on a highly classified mission. The light cruiser USS Helena and the carriers Enterprise and Saratoga were loaded with 5,000 shells equipped with VT fuses. The ammunition was placed under the personal supervision of Commander William Parsons, known as Deke, a naval ordnance officer who had been instrumental in the fuse project's development and would later become famous for arming the Little Boy atomic bomb aboard the Enola Gay on the way to Hiroshima. Parsons consulted with Halsey about which ships were most likely to face air attack in the coming months. The answer was straightforward. Any vessel operating near Guadalcanal was in constant danger from Japanese aircraft based at Rabaul and other airfields throughout the Solomon Islands. Helena, Enterprise, and Saratoga would take the new ammunition into combat. If the fuses worked as promised, they would save lives. If they failed, or worse, if intact examples fell into Japanese hands and revealed the secret, the consequences could be severe. The decision to deploy VT fuses in combat was not made lightly. The risk was calculated and accepted, because the potential benefit was too great to ignore. January 5, 1943. Dawn off Guadalcanal. 4 Japanese Aichi-D 3A dive bombers, Allied reporting name VAL, appeared over a U.S. Navy task force operating in the Solomon Sea. Though slow and increasingly obsolete, the VAL remained dangerous due to its accuracy and structural durability. The dive bombers made their attack runs, and one scored a hit on the New Zealand light cruiser Achilles before the group broke off and turned for home. Lieutenant Commander Red Cochran commanded the aft 5-inch battery aboard the cruiser Helena. As the VALs departed, he ordered his crews to fire. 3 salvos, 14 shells total, VT fused. The second salvo caught one of the retreating dive bombers. The shell didn't strike the aircraft directly. It didn't need to. At a distance of approximately 60 yards, the proximity fuse sensed the reflected radio signal, calculated the Doppler shift indicating relative motion, and triggered the detonation circuit. The shell exploded in a burst of high explosive and steel fragments. The VAL's fuselage erupted in flames, pieces of wing tearing away as the aircraft tumbled from the sky. This was the first confirmed kill of an enemy aircraft using a proximity-fused shell in combat. Helena's gun crews had just fired the opening shot of a revolution in anti-aircraft warfare, but they couldn't celebrate openly, couldn't discuss what had happened, couldn't even acknowledge that their ammunition was different from standard issue. The existence of the VT fuse remained one of the most closely guarded secrets in the American military. Over the following weeks, more ships in the South Pacific received VT ammunition. Operational use expanded carefully, restricted to situations where dud shells would fall into deep water rather than onto land where Japanese forces might recover them. Commanders were instructed to use VT shells only against high-value targets or in critical defensive situations. The scarcity of the ammunition in early 1943 meant it had to be rationed carefully. But every time VT shells were fired, the results reinforced their extraordinary effectiveness. In February 1943, a night attack by a dozen Japanese Mitsubishi G-4M bombers, Allied reporting name Betty, targeted American ships near Guadalcanal. The night sky flickered with muzzle flashes, tracers, floatlights, and the flaming pyramids of splashing Bettys. 5 of the attackers were destroyed, shot down by excellent anti-aircraft formation, firing in conjunction with fire control radar and the deadly proximity fuse. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison would later write that the attackers did not escape with whole hides. Smoking fuselages and bright surface bonfires attested to the accuracy of anti-aircraft batteries and the efficiency of the super-secret Mark 32 shell fuse. The statistics from 1943 revealed the magnitude of the improvement. During that year, American ships fired 9,128 rounds of 5-inch VT ammunition, destroying 61 enemy aircraft. That worked out to 155 rounds per kill. During the same period, ships firing conventional time-fused 5-inch shells averaged 508 rounds per kill. The VT fuse was more than 3 times as effective, and this was with early production models that suffered from reliability problems. Perhaps more remarkably, VT-fused ammunition accounted for more than half of all Japanese aircraft downed by naval gunfire in 1943, despite making up only 25% of the shells fired. The mathematics were undeniable. A fleet equipped entirely with VT ammunition would shoot down twice as many enemy aircraft using the same number of guns and shells. Or looking at it another way, a ship could cut its ammunition expenditure in half while achieving the same defensive effectiveness. But the true test was still ahead. In October 1944, Japanese forces would introduce a tactic so desperate and so effective that it would threaten to overwhelm American defenses through sheer determination. The Kamikaze offensive would push the Navy's anti-aircraft capabilities to their absolute limits, and the proximity fuse would prove to be one of the few technologies capable of stopping pilots who were willing to die in order to sink American ships. October 19, 1944, the Philippines. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi commanded Japan's First Air Fleet with 41 operational aircraft against the largest naval armada in human history. Conventional airstrikes had achieved nothing against American radar-directed fighter patrols and increasingly sophisticated anti-aircraft defenses. His remaining pilots were young, barely trained, flying outdated aircraft against American veterans equipped with superior planes and comprehensive radar coverage. Onishi proposed creating special attack units whose pilots would deliberately crash explosive-laden aircraft into enemy warships. The pilot himself would serve as the guidance system, compensating for poor training and inadequate technology, with direct human control maintained until the instant of impact. Captain Moharu Okamura, who had advocated such tactics since early summer, immediately volunteered to lead the first missions. On October 25, 1944, the first organized kamikaze assault targeted the escort carrier USS St. Lo off Samar Island. A single Zero fighter flown by Yukio Seki plunged through the flight deck at 10:53 in the morning. The bomb exploded inside the hangar bay among fueled aircraft, setting off a chain of violent secondary detonations. Within 30 minutes, St. Lo had disappeared beneath the waves, taking 113 men with her. That moment confirmed a grim equation for Japanese planners. One pilot, one aircraft, one major American warship destroyed. Within days, kamikaze operations expanded throughout the Philippines. By November, more than 30 US vessels had been damaged or sunk by suicide strikes. The Navy's carefully layered air defense system, which had excelled during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, began to falter for reasons American commanders struggled to understand. Conventional bombers approached in groups at altitude, dropped their payloads from distance, and withdrew. Radar could detect them 70 miles away. Fighter patrols had time to intercept. Anti-aircraft gunners could track their approach and set fuses accordingly. Kamikazes shattered that defensive rhythm entirely. They attacked in small numbers, sometimes alone, making radar tracking difficult. They flew low over the waves, appearing only seconds before impact. And most critically, even when hit, they didn't veer away. A kamikaze aircraft struck by anti-aircraft fire might be on fire, might have a dead or dying pilot, but it would continue forward under momentum and the last desperate inputs of a dying man, smashing into hulls or superstructures. Each impact carried not only the bomb's explosion, but the full kinetic energy of an aircraft traveling over 300 miles per hour, combined with hundreds of gallons of fuel igniting on contact. The combined force produced fires and structural damage far exceeding anything caused by conventional bombing. The destroyer, USS Laffey, a Sumner-class vessel, would soon demonstrate that survival against kamikaze attack required more than standard damage control doctrine. It required leadership that anticipated disaster and prepared for it with obsessive thoroughness. Commander Frederick Julian Beckton led Laffey with an intensity forged from personal trauma. He had watched his previous ship, the first USS Laffey, go down at Guadalcanal in November 1942. His later command, USS Aaron Ward, was destroyed by Japanese dive bombers off Guadalcanal on April 7, 1943, leaving 27 dead and 59 wounded. From those experiences, Beckton learned that a crew's only defense lay in preparation that exceeded official requirements. From the day the new Laffey was commissioned in February 1944, Beckton drove his men through relentless damage control drills. Firefighting exercises happened weekly, sometimes multiple times in the same week. Sailors cross-trained so any damage control team could function anywhere on the ship. Beckton distributed firefighting equipment throughout the vessel instead of keeping it centralized in designated storage, directly violating Navy procedure but ensuring that when disaster struck, no man would find himself without tools. He ran secondary fire hoses from alternate water sources. He positioned foam canisters near gun mounts and fuel storage areas. These modifications reflected Beckton's combat experience and his tactical assessment of where kamikaze aircraft were most likely to strike. April 16, 1945, Radar Picket Station No. 1. Laffey was positioned 30 miles northwest of Okinawa, the most exposed and dangerous assignment in the defensive perimeter. At 8:30 in the morning, radar detected incoming enemy aircraft. For the next 80 minutes, 22 separate kamikaze attacks struck the destroyer. 6 aircraft crashed directly into Laffey. 4 bombs hit her. Fires erupted in 5 locations simultaneously. The forward fire main was destroyed. The after engine room flooded. Steering control was lost. Yet Laffey remained afloat. Her damage control teams, trained to a level that exceeded anything required by official doctrine, battled fires using methods and equipment placement that Beckton had drilled into them through endless repetition. When the main fire line failed, crews switched to backup hoses connected to alternate pumps. When gasoline fires erupted near gun mounts, foam was immediately available because Beckton had positioned it there months earlier based on his analysis of kamikaze tactics. When flames threatened the forward magazine, crews flooded it using emergency pumps they had tested during previous drills. By 1000 hours, Laffey was still afloat and still fighting. She had lost 32 men with 71 wounded, but the ship neither sank nor exploded. Against 6 direct kamikaze impacts and 4 bomb hits, training and preparation had kept her alive. Beckton's after-action report described in meticulous detail how his crew had performed, carefully documenting how equipment, placement and intensive training had contributed to survival. Within days, the report reached Rear Admiral Calvin Durgin, commander of the escort carrier group supporting the Okinawa campaign. Durgin recognized immediately that Beckton's approach offered practical solutions to problems being faced across the entire fleet. Other ships began implementing similar modifications, and Beckton's training methods became models for destroyer damage control throughout the Pacific. But while Beckton's preparations addressed what happened after a kamikaze struck, the proximity fuse addressed the more fundamental question of preventing impacts in the first place. And in the desperate spring of 1945 off Okinawa, that technology would face its ultimate test. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Kamikaze campaign at Okinawa became the most sustained aerial assault against naval forces in history. Between April 1st and June 22nd, 1945, Japanese forces launched 10 major waves of coordinated attacks designated Operation Kikusui, floating chrysanthemums. The statistics were devastating. 36 American ships sank, 368 sustained damage. Nearly 5,000 American sailors died, more than perished at Pearl Harbor. Another 4,800 were wounded. The radar picket destroyers bore the brunt of this assault. These vessels, stationed at 16 positions surrounding Okinawa, served as the fleet's early warning system, using their air search radar to detect approaching Japanese aircraft and direct fighter patrols to intercept them. But the pickets themselves, positioned far from the main fleet, lacked sufficient protection. They were the first ships kamikaze pilots encountered after their flight from Kyushu, and many barely trained Japanese aviators attacked whatever vessel appeared first, rather than continuing toward more valuable targets deeper in the formation. Of the 206 ships that served on radar picket duty during the Okinawa campaign, 15 destroyers and 5 landing craft were sunk. 45 destroyers sustained damage. That represented a 29% casualty rate, making picket duty the most hazardous naval surface assignment of the entire war. Sailors called these patrols the graveyard shift, and the nickname was brutally accurate. The destroyer, USS Bush, on April 6, 1945, provides a stark illustration. Assigned to Radar Picket Station No. 1 with USS Calhoun nearby, Bush faced what observers described as a swarm of Japanese aircraft. Estimates ranged from 40 to 60 planes attacking both stations simultaneously. Bush's gunners fought desperately, shooting down several attackers, but 3 kamikaze aircraft struck the destroyer in rapid succession. The ship broke apart and sank, taking her commanding officer and 59 other men to the bottom. The destroyer, USS Manat El Abele, met an even more dramatic end on April 12. After one conventional kamikaze struck the ship, a second weapon appeared, an Oka, cherry blossom, a rocket-powered piloted bomb launched from the belly of a larger aircraft. Streaking toward the destroyer at over 600 miles per hour, the Oka struck Manat El Abele's forward fire room. The explosion split the ship in two. She sank in 5 minutes, killing 79 men. The destroyer, USS Morrison, on May 4th, suffered perhaps the worst fate of any picket ship. At 8:25 in the morning, an Aichi dive bomber struck Morrison's No. 1 stack and bridge, destroying her radar, main battery, and radio. Gunner's mate William Mann recalled the moment with chilling clarity. The first pilot was close enough, you could just see the guy sitting there in the cockpit smiling. He was just as happy as he could be. Minutes later, a second kamikaze smashed into gun mount No. 3, a third hit gun mount No. 5. 4 kamikaze aircraft struck Morrison in less than 5 minutes. The destroyer burned intensely, listing to starboard, before sinking. 152 men died. It was one of the deadliest kamikaze attacks of the entire battle. Commander James Hansen received the Navy Cross for his actions during Morrison's final moments. The ship earned 8 battle stars and 2 Navy Unit Commendation Awards. But medals couldn't change the fundamental mathematics. The Japanese were willing to trade pilots and obsolete aircraft for American destroyers, and the exchange rate, from their perspective, seemed favorable. What Japanese commanders didn't understand was that American defensive capabilities were improving with each engagement. The proximity fuse, deployed more widely with each passing month, was fundamentally altering the defensive equation. By 1945, the fuse's effectiveness had risen to nearly 6 times that of conventional time fuses. Even accounting for a failure rate of approximately 30%, VT-fused ammunition was 4 to 5 times more lethal than traditional shells. The statistics from late 1944 through mid-1945 revealed the transformation. Between October 1944 and August 1945, American naval guns fired ammunition that brought down 278 Japanese aircraft using VT fuses. Analysis indicated that only 46 of these aircraft would have been destroyed if time-fused projectiles had been employed instead. The proximity fuse had increased kill rates by a factor of 6. More remarkably, despite VT ammunition comprising only 75% of rounds fired by 1945, it accounted for the vast majority of aircraft destroyed. The lethal fragment area of a VT-fused shell was 3,000 square feet compared to just 60 square feet for a conventional time fuse. This meant a shell didn't need to detonate within feet of an aircraft. It could explode 70 yards away and still tear through aluminum airframes with deadly shrapnel. The night-kill ratio showed even more dramatic improvement. Conventional time fuses were nearly useless in darkness because optical range-finding couldn't track targets effectively. VT fuses, responding to radar returns from the target itself, functioned identically day or night. Night-kill ratios improved by 370% compared to time-fused ammunition. For Japanese kamikaze pilots who increasingly attacked at dawn or dusk to exploit reduced visibility, this technological advantage proved devastating. The USS Hugh W. Hadley's experience on May 11, 1945, demonstrated both the power and the limitations of proximity-fused ammunition when facing overwhelming assault. Commander Baron Melanie had drilled his crew relentlessly since Hadley's commissioning in November 1944. The destroyer's gunners were among the most proficient in the Pacific Fleet, and their 5-inch guns carried a substantial proportion of VT ammunition. Hadley and the destroyer USS Evans were stationed at Radar Picket Station 1560 miles north of Point Bolo on Okinawa's east coast. At dawn, radar detected large formations of incoming aircraft. For the next 95 minutes, the two destroyers faced wave after wave of Japanese planes in what became one of the war's most violent kamikaze engagements. Hadley's gunners performed magnificently. They shot down 23 enemy aircraft, a record for kills in a single engagement that still stands. The ship's fighter director team guided combat air patrol fighters to intercept even more attackers before they reached the destroyers. But the sheer volume of aircraft eventually broke through. 4 kamikaze planes and 1 bomb struck Hadley directly. Fires swept across the decks. Flooding spread through the engineering compartments. The fantail began settling toward the sea. Commander Melanie ordered all but 50 men into life rafts, keeping only essential damage control teams aboard. Those remaining fought desperately to contain the fires and prevent the ship from breaking apart. Through determination and the training Melanie had instilled, they preserved enough buoyancy for tugboats to tow the crippled destroyer to Kerama Retto anchorage. 30 sailors died. 67 were wounded. Hadley survived, but her damage was too severe for combat restoration. She was towed back to the United States, decommissioned in December 1945, and scrapped 2 years later. The crew received the Presidential Unit Citation. Commander Melanie was awarded the Navy Cross. But the engagement had proven something crucial. Even with proximity fuses, even with superbly trained crews, even with fighter support, determined kamikaze attacks could overwhelm individual ships through sheer numbers. The fuse was a technological marvel, but it wasn't a perfect defense. What the proximity fuse did accomplish was raising the cost of kamikaze operations to unsustainable levels for Japanese forces. Analysis of the 10 Kikusui operations revealed that Imperial Japanese Navy deployed 940 aircraft, and the Imperial Japanese Army deployed 887 aircraft as kamikazes. Of these, 133 scored hits, and 122 scored near misses. More than 2,000 Japanese naval aviators died, along with over 1,000 Army aviators. The exchange rate from the American perspective was far more favorable than Japanese planners had anticipated. Despite 1,900 kamikaze sorties, despite 36 ships sunk and hundreds damaged, the U.S. Pacific Fleet remained fully operational. No heavy ships, no battleships or cruisers were sunk. The Japanese had hoped to inflict casualties so severe that American forces would be compelled to withdraw from Okinawa. That strategic objective failed completely. Part of this failure stemmed from the proximity fuse's ability to destroy aircraft at ranges where conventional ammunition was ineffective. Kamikaze attacks typically occurred at very close range, with aircraft closing fast on their targets. These engagements were exceptionally difficult for weapons firing time-fused ammunition because the rate of change in ballistic range meant fuse settings needed large adjustments from one round to the next. Any delay in getting a shell into the air after its fuse was set meant detonation would occur too far away to reach the target. VT fuses eliminated that problem entirely. Gunners could fire continuous streams of ammunition without worrying about fuse settings. Each shell would automatically detonate at the optimal distance from any aircraft it approached. This was particularly effective against kamikazes because even damaged aircraft continued toward their targets. A kamikaze struck by conventional anti-aircraft fire might lose control but still crash into a ship through momentum. A kamikaze that flew through a VT shell, burst 70 yards away, absorbed shrapnel that destroyed control surfaces, severed hydraulic lines, killed or wounded the pilot, and often ignited fuel tanks. The aircraft might continue forward briefly, but it was already disintegrating. The Japanese never understood why American anti-aircraft fire became so dramatically more effective, beginning in 1943. Intelligence reports noted that American shells seemed to detonate with uncanny precision, always at exactly the right distance from their aircraft. Some Japanese analysts theorized that American radar systems had achieved such sophistication that they could control individual shell bursts. Others believed American gunners possessed extraordinary training that allowed them to predict aircraft movements with near-perfect accuracy. The truth, that each American shell carried its own miniature radar station, remained beyond their comprehension, not because Japanese scientists lacked technical knowledge, but because they couldn't imagine the industrial capacity required to manufacture such devices by the millions. Japan had developed its own proximity fuse design by 1945, a functional device that worked. But they deployed it exactly once, in a single dropped bomb, because they lacked the manufacturing infrastructure to produce them in meaningful quantities. Germany faced identical constraints. German scientists and engineers developed more than 30 different proximity fuse designs for anti-aircraft use. They explored acoustic fuses triggered by engine sound, electrostatic field sensors developed by Rheinmetall Borsig, and radio fuses similar in principle to the American VT design. Some of these prototypes functioned during testing, but none entered service because German industry couldn't manufacture the miniaturized electronic components reliably under wartime conditions, while simultaneously producing aircraft, tanks, submarines, and conventional ammunition. The contrast with American production was stark. By 1944, a large proportion of the American electronics industry concentrated on making proximity fuses. Procurement contracts increased from $60 million in 1942 to $200 million in 1943 to $300 million in 1944, topped by $450 million in 1945. As volume increased, cost per fuse fell from $732 in 1942 to just $18 in 1945. This permitted the purchase of over 22 million fuses for approximately $1 billion, roughly $14.6 billion in current currency. 87 different firms using 110 factories engaged in some phase of production work. Main suppliers included Crosley, RCA, Eastman Kodak, McQuay Norris, and Sylvania. Additionally, more than 2,000 suppliers and sub-suppliers ranging from powder manufacturers to machine shops contributed components. The coordination required was extraordinary. Vacuum tubes manufactured in Cleveland had to meet exact specifications so they would fit properly with circuits assembled in Cincinnati and battery components built in New York. Quality control demanded that every fuse leaving production lines be tested. Sample fuses from each lot were shipped to the National Bureau of Standards for rigorous verification. Despite this comprehensive testing, approximately 30% of VT fuses failed to function in combat. That failure rate would have been unacceptable in peacetime, but it still represented a dramatic improvement over conventional alternatives. The scale of American industrial mobilization behind the proximity fuse mirrored the transformation that had occurred with Sherman tank production. Both programs demonstrated that American factories could manufacture extraordinarily complex devices in quantities that overwhelmed enemy forces through sheer material superiority. Just as Germany couldn't match American tank production, Japan couldn't replicate American fuse manufacturing even after understanding the underlying principles. The proximity fuse's impact extended beyond immediate tactical effectiveness. It fundamentally changed how naval forces operated. Before VT fuses, ships defending against air attack relied on layered defenses. Long-range combat air patrol fighters intercepted bombers far from the fleet. Medium-range 5-inch guns engaged aircraft that penetrated the fighter screen. Close-range 20 and 40 mm guns provided last-ditch defense against planes that survived everything else. This system worked reasonably well against conventional bombers that approached at altitude, dropped their ordnance, and withdrew. It struggled against kamikazes who deliberately penetrated to point-blank range and continued forward even when mortally damaged. The proximity fuse didn't eliminate the problem, but it significantly raised the altitude and distance at which American guns could destroy attacking aircraft. Ships could now engage kamikazes effectively at ranges where conventional time fuses would have been useless. A destroyer's 5-inch battery, equipped with VT ammunition and even simple optical directors like the Mark 51, could bring down aircraft at distances that previously required sophisticated radar-controlled fire direction systems. This was particularly valuable for radar picket destroyers that operated independently far from the main fleet and faced attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. The fuse also reduced crew fatigue, a factor that became increasingly important during the sustained operations at Okinawa. Gunners firing time-fused ammunition needed constant updates on target range, altitude, and predicted intercept points. Fire control teams calculated these parameters using radar tracking data and transmitted fuse settings to each gun mount. The process worked, but it demanded intense concentration from dozens of men working in coordination. VT-fused ammunition simplified this dramatically. Gunners needed only to point their weapons at the target and fire. The shells handled the rest. This meant less sophisticated fire control systems could achieve results that previously required the most advanced equipment available. It also meant gun crews could maintain effective fire even when exhausted, when radar was damaged, or when facing attacks from unexpected directions. By mid-1945, American naval doctrine had evolved to incorporate proximity fuses as a standard element of air defense. Ammunition loading plans specified that 75% or more of 5-inch shells should be VT fused. Training emphasized techniques for engaging multiple targets rapidly, taking advantage of the fuse's ability to function without precise range data. Damage control. Procedures assumed that most attacking aircraft would be destroyed or disabled before reaching ships, shifting focus toward dealing with near misses rather than direct impacts. The innovations developed during the Kamikaze campaign became permanent fixtures of naval warfare. Proximity fuses evolved into more sophisticated systems using radio, optical, and laser detection methods. Modern surface-to-air missiles incorporate proximity fusing as a basic capability, refined far beyond what was possible in 1945, but based on identical principles. The idea that an explosive projectile should sense its target and detonate automatically at the optimal moment is now so fundamental that it seems obvious. In 1940, it seemed impossible. The legacy of Section T and the Applied Physics Laboratory extended beyond the specific technology they created. The program demonstrated that extraordinary engineering challenges could be solved through focused research, massive industrial coordination, and willingness to accept imperfect solutions when perfect ones would arrive too late. Merle Tuve's dictates, don't save money, save time, shoot for 80%, because D is good enough, but F is fatal. These principles shaped American weapons development throughout the Cold War and beyond. The men who developed the proximity fuse rarely received public recognition during their lifetimes. Security restrictions prevented discussion of their work for years after the war ended. When details finally emerged, the technology seemed almost mundane compared to atomic weapons or jet aircraft. But the people who faced Japanese aircraft off Okinawa understood exactly what the fuse meant. It meant shells that exploded at precisely the right moment without human calculation. It meant aircraft destroyed at distances where conventional ammunition was ineffective. It meant survival. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.